Rudolf Höss didn't personally wield the weapon, but he designed a system where killing was a routine, efficient, and silent operation. And he did it from the comfort of his home, with his family just a few meters from the gas chambers. From his childhood, shaped by blind obedience, to his rise as Commandant of Auschwitz, Hurse was the ideal cog in the machine of extermination. He didn't scream, he didn't torture, he calculated. He organized the logistics to kill tens of thousands a day, and he did it with surgical precision without raising his voice, without questioning anything. How do you execute a man who never showed remorse? What really happened in his final days? And what does his trial reveal about the true nature of evil in times of war? Origins of Evil, the Rise of Rudolf Höss. The life of Rudolf Höss began in the quiet town of Baden-Baden in November 1900, an ordinary beginning for the man who would become the architect of the most systematic horror of the 20th century. The son of a merchant with colonial military experience, young Rudolf grew up under the shadow of a stifling discipline and a Catholic rigidity that shaped his early perception of duty and obedience. The Hurse household was not a space for individual expression. It was a training ground for submission to authority. Franz Xaver, his father, had returned from East Africa with precise expectations. His only son would follow the path of the priesthood without question or deviation. This initial hierarchical structure implanted in his conscience was reinforced by private tutors who continued his indoctrination. The boy learned to be silent, to obey, and to find virtue in personal sacrifice. He had no close friends, only routines and obligations. His only genuine relationship was with his horse, a seemingly trivial detail that reveals the profound formative loneliness of someone who would later order the murder of more than 1 million human beings without showing any emotion. The rupture came early. His father's death, when Rudolf was 13, should have represented a liberation, but the void it left was quickly filled by another authoritarian structure. Europe was boiling with pre-Great War tensions, and the adolescent Hurse, without parental pressure but with his obedience training intact, found in the army a new system to subordinate himself to. He lied about his age and, astonishingly, was accepted into the 21st Baden Dragoon Regiment, the same corps where his father and grandfather had served. At 14, when many children are barely out of childhood, Hurse was already wearing the Imperial German uniform. His assignment was to the Turkish front as part of the German Asiatic Corps fighting alongside the Ottoman Empire in Palestine, Iraq, and Syria. The cruelty of war didn't seem to impact him as one might expect a teenager. He was wounded 3 times, contracted malaria, and for his steadfastness received the Iron Cross, Second Class, and the Iron Crescent, awarded by the Turks. Before he turned 18, he was commanding his own cavalry unit, an extraordinary achievement for his age that reflected his cool efficiency. The German defeat in 1918 threw Höss into an unrecognizable country. His mother had died during his absence, and the teenage soldier returned to a humiliated nation where chaos replaced order. The Treaty of Versailles imposed conditions that many Germans considered a betrayal. Höss, trained in rigid structures, found himself in a vacuum of authority that he found intolerable. Like thousands of disoriented veterans, he channeled his frustration into far-right paramilitary groups. The Freikorps were his first political home. These militias, made up primarily of veterans, fought communists and trade unionists while championing a radical nationalist vision of Germany. Hurse found there a new hierarchical structure to replace the lost one, as well as a sense of purpose and a community of military camaraderie. In 1919, he joined the Freikorps Rossbach, where his obedience and coolness made him a valuable member. His radicalization found violent expression in 1923. Hurse, along with other Freikorps members, participated in the murder of Walter Kadow, a teacher accused of having betrayed Albert Leo Schlageter, a nationalist saboteur executed by the French in the occupied Rhineland. The brutality of the act was extreme. Kadow was savagely beaten and killed with a rock to the head. The crime was perpetrated on a farm owned by Martin Bormann, who years later would become Hitler's private secretary. This was no coincidence, but the first link in a web of fatal connections. Hurse was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison for the murder. However, prison did not represent redemption, but rather confirmation. In Brandenburg prison, he shared spaces with other extremists and was treated as a political prisoner with special privileges. There, his worldview crystallized around the idea of a Germany betrayed by Weimar politicians, the communists, and, above all, the Jews. The Catholic religion of his childhood was definitively abandoned, now considered weak and ineffective. His release came in 1928 thanks to a general amnesty. The man who emerged from prison was no longer a confused young man. He was a hardened nationalist, convinced of a historic mission in German reconstruction. The path to National Socialism was paved. Indeed, in 1922, during a leave prior to his imprisonment, Hurse had attended a rally by the then little-known Adolf Hitler in Munich. The future Führer's incendiary oratory made an impression on him, and soon after, he joined the Nazi Party, becoming one of its first registered members. After his release, Hurse's life briefly took an unexpected turn. He joined the Artemann League, a nationalist agrarian organization that promoted a return to the land as a purification of the German spirit. There he met Hedwig Hensel, whom he married in 1929 and with whom he would have 5 children. This bucolic period offered apparent stability, but the connection with National Socialism remained latent. The Artemann League maintained strong ideological ties with the growing Nazi movement. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 opened new doors for Hurse. In 1934, with the party already in control of Germany, he formally joined the Schutzstaffel, SS, the Nazi elite paramilitary force. His prison record and disciplined temperament made him an ideal candidate for the system the Nazis were building. He was assigned to the Dachau concentration camp, the first established by the regime. At Dachau, under the supervision of Theodor Eicke, Hurse learned the fundamentals of what he would later describe as true SS doctrine: absolute obedience, the elimination of compassion, and the systematic use of terror as a tool of control. Eicke was not only a fanatical ideologue, but also a methodical organizer who was laying the administrative foundations of the Nazi concentration camp system. Hurse absorbed these lessons with the same discipline he had displayed in the army. His efficiency earned him promotions. He was promoted to Rapportführer, block leader, and later transferred to Sachsenhausen, another key camp located on the outskirts of Berlin. There he oversaw executions and honed his administrative skills. He was no longer a mere guard. He was becoming a vital cog in the Nazi repressive machine. His ability to coordinate complex operations without showing emotion distinguished him among his peers. During this period, Hurse developed a close relationship with Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS and future architect of the Reich's repressive apparatus. This connection would be decisive for his future. In 1940, when the Germans needed to expand their camp system into the occupied territories, Himmler personally selected Hurse for a specific mission: to inspect a former Polish barracks near Krakow that could be converted into a new concentration camp. The chosen location was a disused military compound on the outskirts of a small town called Auschwitz. The Germans called it Auschwitz. What Hurse saw in this place was not just an opportunity for advancement, but the stage where his obedience, efficiency, and emotional coolness would culminate in the greatest systematic crime in modern history. The architect of Auschwitz, creation of the extermination camp. On May 1, 1940, Rudolf Höss assumed the position that would immortalize him in the darkest pages of history: Commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp. The appointment was no coincidence. Hurse embodied precisely the characteristics the Reich needed: military discipline, administrative efficiency, and above all, an unwavering ideological loyalty combined with a peculiar emotional detachment. The choice of site was based on pragmatic considerations. The former military complex offered usable basic infrastructure: barracks, rudimentary sanitary facilities, and administrative buildings. Its geographical location was optimal. It was situated at a railway junction connecting Germany with the newly conquered Eastern Territories, facilitating mass transportation. Furthermore, its relative isolation in a rural area of occupied Poland provided the necessary discretion for the activities to be carried out there. From his arrival, Höss demonstrated a systematic vision. The camp was to be self-sufficient, functional, and expandable. The former barracks were converted to house prisoners, primarily Polish political opponents in this initial phase. A perimeter of electric wire fences was built along with watchtowers at strategic points and a wall separating the complex from the outside world. Operational autonomy was a priority. Bakeries, laundries, workshops, and warehouses were established. This was not just a detention center, it was a productive entity serving the Reich. This first development, later known as Auschwitz the Hurse, became the administrative center of the entire complex. The command offices, quarters for SS officers and non-commissioned officers, and Höss's personal residence were located there. The commandant moved there with his wife, Hedwig, and their 5 children. The layout of Auschwitz reflected Höss's military and bureaucratic mentality. Rectangular brick blocks arranged in orderly rows, straight streets methodically numbered, and spaces for formations and control. The famous motto, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, was posted above the entrance, a macabre irony for those who passed through its gates. The real transformation began after Heinrich Himmler's visit in March 1941. The Reichsführer SS was impressed by Höss's organizational efficiency. During this inspection, Himmler personally informed him of expansion plans that would radically change the nature of the camp. He ordered the construction of a second, much larger complex, initially capable of housing 100,000 prisoners, mainly Soviets. This expansion was linked to the imminent Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union that was to begin in June of that year. This new complex, named Auschwitz II Birkenau, was to be built approximately 3 kilometers from the original camp near the village of Brzezinka, Birkenau in German. Hurse personally oversaw the planning, selecting a marshy terrain that required extensive drainage work carried out by prisoners under extreme conditions. Thousands died during this construction phase, foreshadowing the fate of millions to follow. What would distinguish Birkenau would not only be its size, but its purpose. As Nazi policy radicalized in 1941, particularly after the invasion of the USSR, the final solution began to take shape. In this context, Auschwitz would transform from a conventional concentration camp into a facility specifically designed for mass extermination. The decisive moment came in September 1941. Hurse authorized a macabre experiment in Block 11 of Auschwitz, known as the Death Block. A group of approximately 850 prisoners, mainly Soviet and Polish, selected arbitrarily, were locked in the building's basement. There, SS officers, under the supervision of Deputy Commandant Karl Fritsch and with Höss's approval, introduced for the first time crystals of Zyklon B, a hydrocyanic acid-based pesticide originally developed for disinfection. The result was considered successful by the executioners. All the prisoners died within minutes without the need for ammunition or direct involvement of the executioners. This moment marks the birth of the method that would become a symbol of the Holocaust. Höss, always methodical, ordered studies on the optimal amount of gas needed based on the volume of the chamber and the number of victims, the ideal temperature to maximize its effect, and the precise timing for subsequent ventilation. The escalation toward mass extermination coincided with the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where senior Nazi officials coordinated the implementation of the final solution. Although Hurse did not directly participate in this meeting, its effects radically transformed Auschwitz. Himmler had already informed him months earlier that the camp would be the main extermination center for European Jews, precisely because of its strategic location and capacity for expansion. During 1942 and 1943, under Höss's direction, Birkenau underwent a radical transformation. Initially, 2 temporary extermination facilities were built, known as Bunker 1 and Bunker 2, or Red House and White House, respectively. They were farm buildings converted into gas chambers, with improvised crematoria in outdoor pits. They soon proved inadequate. The industrialization of genocide reached its peak with the construction of 4 large extermination complexes known as Crematoria 2, 3, 4, and V. Each complex featured underground or above-ground gas chambers capable of simultaneously murdering thousands of people directly connected to high-capacity crematoria. The design, developed by the German civilian firm Topf and Söhne, allowed thousands of bodies to be processed daily with minimal personnel. To facilitate this process, Hurse ordered the construction of a railway branch that ran directly into Birkenau, terminating at a central platform known as the Ramp. There, deportees disembarked the trains and underwent selection. SS doctors, including the infamous Josef Mengele, decided with a simple gesture who would live temporarily as slave laborers and who would be immediately sent to the gas chambers. The efficiency of the system is shocking in its calculated coldness. The new arrivals, exhausted after days of travel in inhumane conditions, were greeted with a false sense of order. They were instructed to neatly leave their belongings for disinfection, undress, and prepare for a shower after the long journey. The gas chambers were designed to simulate sanitary facilities, with fake showers on the ceiling. Only when the doors were hermetically sealed was the deception exposed. Once the chambers were sealed, SS personnel would throw Zyklon B pellets through openings in the ceiling or walls. The dying process lasted between 10 and 20 minutes, during which the prisoners experienced progressive asphyxiation and agonizing convulsions. Höss, in his later memoirs, would coldly describe how the bodies were piled up in a pyramid shape, with the strongest at the top desperately gasping for the air that no longer existed. The subsequent processing of the corpses was the responsibility of the Sonderkommando, groups of prisoners, mainly Jews, forced under threat of death to perform this gruesome task. They extracted gold teeth, cut hair for industrial use, and transported the bodies to the furnaces. The dehumanization was absolute. The corpses were referred to in official documents as pieces or units. In parallel to this machinery of death, Hurse developed a third component of the complex, Auschwitz III Monowitz, also known as Buna, a forced labor camp to supply German industry, particularly the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant. Prisoners assigned to Monowitz were literally worked to death, with life expectancies rarely exceeding 3 months due to the combination of grueling labor, malnutrition, and disease. The administration of the complex followed a strict hierarchical structure. Hurse, as commandant, held the top position, assisted by several deputies responsible for specific areas. The Lagerführers, sub-camp commanders, oversaw the various sections of the complex. The Rapportführers controlled individual blocks and coordinated forced labor. Perimeter guarding and surveillance duties fell to the SS Totenkopfverbände, dead skull units. To facilitate internal control, the Nazis implemented a system of prisoner officials. Kapos, Blockältester, and other privileged prisoners collaborated in internal administration in exchange for small benefits. This strategy not only reduced the need for German personnel, but also created divisions among the prisoners themselves, hindering solidarity and organized resistance. Höss's administrative meticulousness was legendary. He maintained constant communication with SS headquarters in Berlin, sending detailed reports on operational capabilities, the number of processed personnel, and the efficiency of the facilities. The language used in these documents reveals absolute dehumanization. Terms like pieces, units, and material replaced any reference to human beings. His personal life during this period presents a disturbing contrast. He lived with his family in a comfortable villa within the complex, just a few meters from Crematorium 1. His children played in the gardens while the crematorium chimneys burned incessantly. His wife, Hedwig, maintained a tidy and cozy home, seemingly isolated from the surrounding reality. In his later memoirs, Hurse would mention the tranquility he felt returning to this domestic environment after days overseeing mass extermination. Husse's double life exemplifies what Hannah Arendt would later describe as the banality of evil, the human capacity to compartmentalize existence, to simultaneously be a loving parent and systematically organize the murder of millions. He was not an irrational psychopath, but an efficient bureaucrat who viewed genocide as an assigned administrative task, disconnected from any moral reflection. In November 1943, after more than 3 years directing Auschwitz, Hurse was temporarily relieved of his direct command due to multiple scandals, including an affair with a political prisoner and suspicions of corruption in the management of confiscated property. However, he did not fall into disgrace. He was promoted to head of Department the Ones of the SS Main Office for Economics and Administration, a position from which he oversaw all the Reich's concentration camps. However, their connection with Auschwitz wasn't over. In 1944, faced with Allied advances and the imminent defeat of the Reich, the Nazis accelerated the extermination. The efficiency of horror Operation Hurse and the Hungarian genocide. In the spring of 1944, as the Allied forces advanced inexorably through Europe and the defeat of the Third Reich seemed increasingly inevitable, An unprecedented extermination operation began to take shape. The architects of the Holocaust, far from halting their work in the face of imminent defeat, decided to accelerate it. This final phase, the most intense and brutal of the Nazi genocide, would be directed by the man who had turned Auschwitz into a death factory, Rudolf Höss, who would return specifically to oversee what would become known internally as Action Hurse or Operation Hurse. The geopolitical context of this phase is crucial to understanding its development. Until March 1944, Hungary had remained an ambivalent Axis ally. Under Admiral Miklos Horthy, the country had implemented anti-Semitic legislation, but had partially resisted German pressure to deport its Jewish population. This community, the second largest in Europe with approximately 725,000 people, had remained relatively protected while millions perished in the surrounding occupied territories. The situation changed dramatically when German intelligence services detected contacts between Hungary and the Allies, interpreted as preparations to defect from the Axis. Hitler ordered the military occupation of the country on March 19, 1944, in Operation Margaret. The Hungarian government was reduced to a puppet administration controlled by Berlin, and the SS immediately assumed control of policies regarding the Jewish population. Adolf Eichmann, who had already coordinated deportations from other European countries, was sent to Budapest to organize the logistics. At the same time, Heinrich Himmler requested the presence of Rudolf Höss for a special mission. Despite having been transferred to an administrative post in Berlin in November 1943, Höss was still considered the foremost expert on efficient mass extermination. His task, to return to Auschwitz to prepare the camp for the imminent arrival of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews in the shortest possible time. The operation began with military precision. Between April and May 1944, Hungarian Jews were concentrated in improvised ghettos, mainly in rural areas of the northeast of the country. The Hungarian gendarmerie, actively collaborating with the SS, implemented the measures with surprising effectiveness. Entire families were evicted with only hours' notice, allowed to take only small personal belongings. The ghettos, characterized by unsanitary conditions and extreme overcrowding, functioned as temporary stations before deportation. Coordination between Budapest and Auschwitz was constant. Eichmann designed a railway system that allowed the transport of between 12,000 and 14,000 people daily to the camps. Hurse, meanwhile, adapted Auschwitz-Birkenau to accommodate this unprecedented influx. The railway branch within the camp was extended to allow trains to run directly to the crematoria, eliminating waiting times and maximizing efficiency. On May 15, 1944, the first train departed from Hungary. Over the next 56 days, approximately 147 trains transported more than 430,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. The operation reached unprecedented levels. On some days, as many as 4 trains arrived, each carrying between 2,000 and 3,000 people crammed into freight cars without sanitary facilities, sufficient food, or water. Many died during the journey, especially the elderly and children. Arrival at Auschwitz represented the beginning of an industrialized process of death. The trains stopped at the central ramp at Birkenau, where the deportees disembarked amid screams, barking dogs, and blows. Men and women were immediately separated. SS medical officers, dressed in white coats to reinforce the illusion of a sanitary procedure, carried out the selection with almost imperceptible gestures, left for forced labor, right for immediate death. The criteria were brutally pragmatic. Approximately 70 to 80% of each transport was sent directly to the gas chambers. All children and the elderly, pregnant women or women with young children, the sick or the weak. Only apparently robust young men and women were temporarily selected for slave labor. During the Hungarian operation, the proportion of those gassed immediately reached unprecedented levels, reaching 90% in some transports. Deception was an integral part of the system. Those selected for death were told they would be showered and disinfected before entering the camp. In some cases, they were even given soap and towels to reinforce the lie. They were instructed to remember where they left their belongings so they could retrieve them later, a cruel irony considering their immediate fate. Children were often separated with the promise of being reunited with their mothers later. The gas chambers, designed to simulate sanitary facilities, could hold between 1,000 and 2,000 people simultaneously. Once full, the reinforced doors were sealed shut. SS personnel wearing gas masks threw Zyklon B pellets through special openings. The gas, upon contact with air, released hydrocyanic acid. Death by asphyxiation was not instantaneous. The process took between 10 and 20 minutes, during which the victims experienced convulsions, vomiting, and hemorrhages before succumbing. During the Hungarian operation, the system reached unprecedented maximum capacities. Höss, in later testimony, claimed that on peak days up to 10,000 people were murdered in 24 hours. This figure was corroborated by recovered German documents and the testimony of guards. To maintain this pace, all crematoria operated simultaneously, and when these proved insufficient, open-air incineration pits were reactivated. These pits, dug near crematoria V and 6, measured approximately 50 meters long, 8 meters wide, and 2 meters deep. The bodies were placed in alternating layers of wood and doused with fuel. The heat generated was so intense that body fat became additional fuel. The black smoke and acrid smell permeated the atmosphere for miles around. Witnesses described how the sky above Birkenau remained permanently darkened and ash floated in the air like macabre grey snowfall. The scale of the extermination posed unprecedented logistical problems. The crematoria, designed to incinerate approximately 4,400 bodies daily, were operating far beyond their rated capacity. This led to frequent breakdowns, which Hurse managed by reallocating resources. The pits allowed for the incineration of additional bodies, but they created other problems: soil contamination with human fat and difficulties in preventing the fire from spreading uncontrollably. Another critical aspect was the management of the deportees' confiscated belongings. Hungarian Jews, less affected by previous restrictions, arrived with goods of considerable value. Höss expanded the sorting facility known as Canada, where selected prisoners meticulously catalogued these goods. Dental gold was melted into ingots, jewelry and currency were sent to the Reichsbank, usable clothing was distributed to Germans affected by bombing, and human hair was destined for the textile industry. This parasitic economic system represented a significant source of income for the Reich. Operation Hurse represented a radical refinement of genocidal efficiency. The time between unloading the train, selection and extermination was optimized to a minimum. The Sonderkommando, groups of prisoners forced to handle corpses, were expanded. These men, regularly executed and replaced to eliminate witnesses, constituted another perverse element of the system. Victims forced to participate in the prosecution of other convicts. Adolf Eichmann coordinated logistics, train schedules, and deportation priorities from Budapest. At Auschwitz, Hurse meticulously supervised operations, reviewed statistics, and implemented procedural adjustments. His reports to Berlin, written in dispassionate technical language, illustrated the complete conceptual dehumanization that allowed extermination to be conceived as a mere administrative problem. This frantic phase continued until early July 1944, when international pressure and the certainty of military defeat led Regent Horthy to suspend the deportations. By then, 75% of Hungary's Jewish population had been annihilated, primarily at Auschwitz. Only the Budapest community, approximately 200,000 people, remained temporarily protected. The Hungarian operation marked a historic turning point. Never before or since had so many people been murdered in such a short period of time, more than 430,000 in just 56 days. Surprisingly, these transports were given priority even over military convoys in the midst of a German retreat, demonstrating the ideological primacy of genocide over practical military considerations. Fall of the Empire, the escape and capture of Rudolf Höss. In January 1945, as the Red Army advanced toward Poland, the sound of Soviet artillery began to echo in Auschwitz. For Rudolf Höss and the other architects of the Holocaust, the hour of collapse had arrived. This collapse would mean not only military defeat, but also the unveiling of crimes they had attempted to carry out far from public scrutiny. On January 17th, Heinrich Himmler authorized the complete evacuation of Auschwitz. A feverish destruction of evidence then began. Compromising documents were burned, key installations were blown up, archives were incinerated. In the rush, thousands of documents remained intact, later providing crucial evidence for investigators. The following day, the infamous death marches began. Approximately 60,000 prisoners were evacuated on foot in the depths of the Polish winter to more western camps. Those who collapsed from exhaustion or attempted escape were immediately executed. Around 15,000 died during these marches, extending the death toll of Auschwitz far beyond its physical limits. On January 27th, Soviet advance units finally liberated the camp. They found approximately 7,000 prisoners too sick to be evacuated. The soldiers, hardened by years of war, were deeply shocked by evidence of an unprecedented industrialized horror, mountains of confiscated belongings, barracks overcrowded with dying people, and partially destroyed but recognizable extermination facilities. By then, Hurse was already operating out of Ravensbrück, a camp near Berlin intended primarily for women. In March 1945, facing imminent defeat, he received instructions from Himmler: disappear. He meticulously adopted the false identity of Franz Lang, supposedly a naval non-commissioned officer with no connection to the SS. With falsified documentation, likely provided by clandestine networks aiding Nazi fugitives, he altered his appearance and headed toward Schleswig-Holstein, a region near the Danish border. He settled on a small farm in Gottrupel as a farmhand under his false identity. His wife, Hedwig, and their 5 children hid separately, also under false identities. The strategy initially worked. The former Auschwitz commandant became an anonymous rural worker, avoiding unnecessary interactions and maintaining an extremely low profile. Meanwhile, the Allies made progress cataloging Nazi war crimes and establishing legal mechanisms to prosecute those responsible. In August 1945, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg was formed. Hurse figured prominently on the wanted lists, but his whereabouts remained unknown. In March 1946, British forces received information about the possible whereabouts of the Hurse family. An intelligence team led by Captain Hans Alexander was assigned to investigate. Alexander, a German Jew who had fled to England with his family in 1936, brought a personal motivation to the mission in addition to his professional duty. They first located Hedwig Hurse. After being arrested on March 5th, she eventually revealed her husband's whereabouts. He was working as a farmhand under a false identity near Gottrupel. The capture occurred on the night of March 11th. Alexander's team found Hurse sleeping in a shed. He initially maintained his false identity, presenting documents as Franz Lang. Alexander, however, noticed that he was wearing a wedding ring, unusual for a supposedly single sailor. When they demanded to see the inside of the ring, they found the names of Hurse and his wife engraved on it. It was definitive confirmation. Hurse then attempted to use a cyanide capsule sewn into his clothing, but was restrained before he could use it. According to later accounts, this arrest was emotionally charged for Alexander, whose relatives had perished in the Holocaust. What was most disconcerting to his captors was Hurse's reaction. He showed no remorse, no begging for mercy, no emotional breakdown. He maintained the same cold, mechanical demeanor that had characterized him during his command. When questioned about his role at Auschwitz, he responded with technical precision, as if providing an administrative report. His testimony was so valuable that he was brought to Nuremberg as a witness in the ongoing trials. On April 15, 1946, he took the stand in the case against Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Paradoxically, his detailed testimony proved devastating for other defendants, confirming the systematic and hierarchical nature of the genocide. In Nuremberg, Hurse also drafted an affidavit detailing his activities. He estimated that approximately 2.5 million people had been murdered at Auschwitz, a figure later adjusted to 1.1 million by historians, but which unequivocally confirmed the industrial scale of the extermination. Military psychologist Gustav Gilbert evaluated Hurse during this period, concluding that he did not exhibit conventional psychopathology. He was neither an irrational psychopath nor suffering from delusions. He represented something perhaps more disturbing, a man with technical normality but completely devoid of moral empathy, capable of completely dissociating his atrocious acts from any ethical evaluation. This assessment anticipated what Hannah Arendt, observing Adolf Eichmann, would later call the banality of evil, the human capacity to commit inconceivable atrocities not out of personal sadism but out of the absolute subordination of moral conscience to bureaucratic and ideological structures. While Hurse was testifying, the Polish provisional government formally requested his extradition. Poland, where Auschwitz was located, claimed primary jurisdiction to try him. The request was granted, and on May 25, 1946, Hurse was transferred to Warsaw to face a full trial. Justice in the Ruins, the trial in Poland. In the spring of 1947, as Europe attempted to rebuild from the rubble of the most devastating war in history, an unprecedented trial began in Warsaw. Rudolf Höss faced the Polish Supreme National Court for crimes that defied human comprehension. This was no ordinary trial. It represented an attempt to re-establish ethical and legal foundations after their deepest rupture. Post-war Poland was a particularly significant setting for this reckoning. The country had lost approximately 6 million citizens during the Nazi occupation, almost 20% of its population. Of these, 3 million were Polish Jews, almost completely annihilated. Polish territory had been home to the main extermination centers: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. The geography of the genocide coincided almost entirely with Poland's borders. After his extradition, Hurse was interned in Montelupik prison in Krakow, notorious during the occupation as a detention center for Polish resistance fighters. In the months leading up to his trial, he was ordered to write his memoirs, a document that would later become crucial historical evidence about the inner workings of the extermination system. The resulting text, later published as Commander of Auschwitz, is one of the most disturbing documents ever written. Höss described the systematic extermination of millions in the same dispassionate, administrative tone he would have used to explain routine logistical operations. This emotional detachment would also characterize his demeanor during the trial. To try Nazi war criminals, the provisional government had established the National Supreme Court by decree of January 1946. This court had jurisdiction over war crimes and crimes against humanity committed between 1939 and 1945. It had previously prosecuted figures such as Arthur Greiser, Nazi administrator of the Wottegau region, and Arthur Lieberhenschel, who had briefly succeeded Hurse at Auschwitz. The trial formally began on March 11, 1947. The court was presided over by Judge Alfred Eimer, accompanied by associate judges and assessors. The prosecution, led by Tadeusz Cyprian, presented specific charges that went beyond obedience to superior orders, emphasizing Höss's personal initiative and zeal in implementing and optimizing the extermination. The formal charges included participation in the murder of civilians and prisoners of war as Commandant of Auschwitz, mistreatment, torture, and inhumane acts against civilians and prisoners, and membership in a criminal organization, the SS. What distinguished this trial was its exhaustive focus on Auschwitz, allowing a painstaking reconstruction of the camp's operations from its establishment to its transformation into the main center of the final solution. For 3 weeks, the tribunal heard testimony from more than 30 witnesses, including survivors, former guards, and war crimes experts. Among the most shocking was that of Stanisława Rachwałowa, a political prisoner who had witnessed selections and gassings, describing how Höss watched impassively as he made adjustments to increase efficiency. Also crucial was the testimony of Henrik Tauber, a former member of the Sonderkommando, who detailed the operation of crematoria and gas chambers from his traumatic experience. Jan Sen, the investigating judge who documented Auschwitz after its liberation, presented a forensic analysis of the camp, explaining how every aspect of the camp was designed to facilitate mass murder with maximum efficiency. His investigations refuted any possibility that Hurse was unaware of the magnitude of what had occurred under his command. When confronted with testimony about his presence at the selection chute, where he decided who would be immediately gassed and who would be temporarily assigned to forced labor, Hurse did not deny his participation. He confirmed that he carried out these selections regularly and that he sent women with children, the elderly and the sick, to their immediate deaths because they were unfit for labor. This admission, expressed without apparent emotion, deeply shocked those present. At the end of the trial, when he was given the final say, he made a brief and ambiguous statement. He acknowledged that terrible things had occurred under his command, but maintained that his personal responsibility was limited by the hierarchical structure. He did not explicitly ask for mercy, seeming to accept that his fate was sealed. He concluded by saying, "For the crimes against humanity that were committed, I deserve my punishment." This seemingly contrite statement was couched in the passive voice, subtly distancing himself from direct agency. On April 2, 1947, the National Supreme Court delivered its verdict. Rudolf Höss was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death by hanging. In its reasoning, the court emphasized that he had not been a mere executioner, but an active architect of the extermination system, having applied personal initiative to perfect methods of mass murder and displayed a complete lack of genuine remorse. The sentence included an exceptional provision. The execution was to be carried out at Auschwitz within the boundaries of the former camp. This decision responded to requests from organizations of former prisoners and families of victims who argued that symbolic justice required Höss to face his end in the same place where he had orchestrated the deaths of more than 1 million people. The following days revealed contradictory facets of his personality. He continued writing his memoirs with the same clinical precision, but he began to show signs of reflection that had been absent during the trial. In letters to his family, he expressed remorse primarily for the impact his actions would have on them, not on his victims. Significantly, he returned to the Catholic faith of his childhood. He requested and received the sacraments from Father Władysław Loan, a Polish Jesuit priest. When questioned about his faith during Auschwitz, Hurse replied that he had left God outside the camp gate. This phrase epitomized the moral compartmentalization that had allowed him to function as a death camp commandant while maintaining a seemingly normal family life. For Poland, the trial represented an initial step in a long process of national healing, allowing victims to see one of the main perpetrators face justice. It was also a declaration of regained sovereignty. The nation singled out as the primary stage of the Holocaust was now administering justice to one of its architects. Meanwhile, Hurse waited in an austere cell. According to guards, he maintained a methodical routine, slept without apparent nightmares, and continued writing. He showed no outward signs of terror or despair. The same discipline he had applied while running Auschwitz seemed to sustain him now in the face of his own imminent death. In his final writings, however, reflections first appear that suggest some belated understanding of the moral magnitude of his actions. He wrote, "My conscience compels me to admit guilt for the terrible atrocities that were committed. I will particularly pay for this with my life." Yet even these statements contained ambiguities. Passive formulation, atrocities that were committed rather than atrocities I committed, and contextualization within the regime's broader agenda, suggesting a reluctance to assume full moral responsibility. The execution of the hangman, the end in his own hell. Dawn on April 16, 1947, fell grey and cold over Upper Silesia, Poland. The former Auschwitz complex, where just 2 years earlier the last of more than 1 million human beings had perished, would be the scene of a final act of justice. The execution of Rudolf Höss, the man who had transformed a military barracks into the most efficient machine of death ever built. The decision to execute him there was not arbitrary. Former prisoner organizations had requested that the sentence be carried out in the same place where he had wielded absolute power. This request, approved as an act of poetic justice, meant that the commander would face his death in the same place where he had ordered so many others. Carpenters, ironically German prisoners of war in Polish custody, built a simple but sturdy gallows next to the former crematorium at Auschwitz, just a few meters from the house where Hurse had lived with his family. This proximity between his former residence and the machinery of death had always been a disturbing metaphor for his compartmentalization. Now this juxtaposition took on a final dimension. The execution, initially scheduled for April 15th, was postponed for a day for security reasons following reports of possible lynching attempts during the transfer. Authorities established a security perimeter around the compound. In the surrounding area, where virtually every family had lost members in the camp, emotions remained high. During his final days at Montelupich, Hurse had shown subtle changes. The man who had maintained a mechanical coolness during the trial began to exhibit introspection. He received Catholic sacraments from Father Loan, formally returning to the faith he had abandoned decades earlier. This belated religious reconciliation raises troubling questions. Did it represent genuine repentance or simply ritual consolation in the face of impending death? In his final writings, addressed primarily to his family, he asked Hedwig to raise her 5 children in a different spirit than that which had inspired his own actions. He requested that she eventually explain to them why their father had been executed, but emphasizing that he was not a murderer at heart. This formulation reveals persistent cognitive dissonance. Until the very end, he seemed unable to reconcile his concrete actions with his internal self-image. On the morning of the execution, he was awakened at 5 a.m. He methodically ate a simple breakfast, dressed in clean prison clothes, and was handcuffed. His last request was to send his wedding ring to his wife, a request that was granted. At 8 a.m., a vehicle transported him from Krakow to Auschwitz, approximately 65 kilometers. Security was tight. Additional vehicles with armed guards escorted the convoy. Hurse remained silent during the journey, occasionally glancing at the spring landscape. Upon arrival, he was briefly escorted to the former Kommandantur, Commandant's office, a building that had served as an operational center during his tenure. According to witness accounts, he asked for one last coffee, which he sipped calmly. This mundane routine in such a charged context was unsettling for those present. At 10 a.m., he was transferred to Block 11, known during the camp's operation as the Death Block. He remained in this building, infamous for housing punishment and execution cells, for approximately an hour. It was a deliberate wait, designed to give him a brief experience of the same facilities where thousands had suffered under his command. The area surrounding the gallows had been cordoned off. The execution would not be public in the traditional sense. Onlookers were not allowed. However, approximately 100 official witnesses were present: government representatives, judicial officials, forensic doctors, accredited journalists, and, significantly, former Auschwitz prisoners representing various nationalities who had suffered in the camp. At 10:08 a.m., Höss was led to the gallows. He walked with measured steps, neither hurried nor hesitant. Witnesses would describe his expression as distant and resigned, but not terrified. He climbed the steps without assistance, maintaining the same discipline and control he had exercised as commander. The structure stood next to the building that had housed the first crematorium, where the first experiments with Zyklon B gas were conducted in 1941. The proximity was not coincidental. It symbolized the complete cycle of a system that called for its own architect. The Polish prosecutor formally read the sentence. Höss listened without interrupting. When asked if he had any last words, he replied briefly in German, "I regret my actions. I pay with my life." This final statement, like many before it, was deliberately ambiguous. Regret could be interpreted as moral repentance or simply acknowledgement of negative personal consequences. The executioner placed the rope around his neck. Some accounts indicate that Höss slightly adjusted the position of the rope, a final act of personal control. At exactly 10:09, the trap door was activated. The Auschwitz commandant was left suspended between heaven and earth. The body remained hanging for approximately 15 minutes. The medical examiner confirmed the death at 10:21. Höss had died of a cervical fracture and asphyxiation. The man who had designed a system to efficiently suffocate millions was now experiencing a similar death, albeit one that was individualized and preceded by a fair trial, conditions denied to his victims. The final fate of his body sparked debate. There was concern that his grave could become a pilgrimage site for Nazi sympathizers. Ultimately, it was decided to cremate him, a final irony considering the ovens he had built, and scatter his ashes in an undisclosed location. There would be no grave, no monument, no physical reference to his memory. According to eyewitnesses, the former prisoners who witnessed the execution displayed neither jubilation nor vengeful satisfaction. One French survivor described, "I felt no joy. I felt that a certain order had been restored to the universe, but the enormity of what was lost made any sense of triumph impossible." This reaction reflects the fundamentally unsatisfactory nature of any punishment for crimes of such magnitude. No retribution, however just, could compensate for millions of lives lost. The execution represented much more than individual punishment. It was an act of collective symbolic justice, an attempt to restore a certain moral balance. The exact spot where he was hanged remains discreetly marked within the Auschwitz Museum complex today. Not as a monument to the perpetrator, but as a reminder that justice, however imperfect and incomplete, eventually reached one of the main architects of the genocide. The system he helped create did not completely die with him. Other perpetrators escaped justice. Some, like Eichmann, would be captured decades later. Many would live full lives without facing consequences. The wounds of the Holocaust continue to affect later generations of survivors and their descendants. 75 years later, the fundamental questions raised by the life and crimes of Rudolf Höss remain urgently relevant. In a world where genocide and institutionalized dehumanization persist, his story is not merely historical but prophetically topical. It reminds us that the most destructive evil does not always arise from uncontrolled passions, but frequently from the cold and calculated subordination of fundamental ethical principles to bureaucratic systems and ideological loyalties. Hurse died as he had lived, disciplined, controlled, seemingly disconnected from the full moral significance of his actions. But he died under the rule of law after a fair trial, with the opportunity for defense and appeal. These elements of formal justice represent precisely the principles he had denied to millions. His execution was not merely punitive, but restorative. He reaffirmed the humanity of his victims by treating even his executioner with greater humanity than he had shown himself.